From the gridiron to the hardwood, James Mesh breaks it all down. It's time for another episode of Cleats and Sneaks.
The time has come. It's finally here. Super Bowl 59 between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles is here as we are in New Orleans inside the convention center. We've been broadcasting live here all week long for ESPN Southwest Louisiana for our station, doing all of our local shows here. This is the first time for us, and it was an absolute phenomenal experience. And to cap it all off, I do want to bring back the Cleats and Sneaks podcast for all of you as we preview this big-time game. Welcome into yet another edition of this podcast. I am your host, James Mesh, where we talk about everything going on with the NFL and the NBA. Of course, the NBA, it's had the trade deadline. It came and went, and there were quite a few big moves. Jimmy Butler going to the Warriors. You also had Luka Doncic going to the Lakers. One of the craziest things that ever has gone down, especially in quite a while. We'll get to more of that in next week's episode and kind of talking about what's going on there. And we'll even give a recap of what went down inside New Orleans for Super Bowl 59. But for this podcast, let's actually break down this matchup because I think it's so fascinating. The fact that I was able to really see them throughout the season, and it's hard to deny what's going on with Kansas City since they are on the verge of being the first ever team in NFL history to win 3 straight Super Bowls. Never have seen that before. This would be the first time in history to ever see it. Well, we're also looking at a Philadelphia team that has looked absolutely phenomenal this season. The fact that they got the addition of Saquon Barkley in free agency from their hated rival, the New York Giants, this was the absolute key for them to take that next step forward. Because remember, this matchup happened just a couple of years ago over on the West Coast. And let me tell you, that was an absolute dandy of a game. Kansas City ended up getting the win 38-35. I'm not quite sure that I am expecting that high of a score, but I do think that it'll be pretty close to that because even though both of these teams have very good defense, do not get me wrong, Philadelphia has taken that next step forward, and everybody on that defensive unit has been absolutely phenomenal for them. Get some key guys over the last couple of drafts, as well as getting some guys in free agency. Zach Bond was the absolute steal of it all, getting him from the New Orleans Saints for an absolute bargain of a deal. If I'm not mistaken, 1 year, about $5 million. Like, that's nothing. And he was a part of the All-Pro team. He played an absolute phenomenal season so far. So the fact that they got him, Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis, them on the interior defensive line. You also have guys in the secondary. Cooper DeJean, he was another fantastic addition in the draft for them. And you look at so many other guys across Philly's line of scrimmage, offense, defense. It's been crazy to see how well they played. And look, it's actually a little bit different than I think we would maybe anticipate because we look at nowadays NFL and we look how football is. It's so pass-centric, but what's so fascinating about the Eagles is the fact that they rely so heavy on the run game. The fact that Saquon Barkley is the guy that gets the majority of the touches. Does he necessarily get all the touchdowns? No, because of the infamous tush push. Jalen Hurts ends up getting quite a few of those touchdowns. But let me tell you, I think the fact that you have that dynamic duo in the backfield, that has been a big part as to why we've seen Philadelphia get back to the Super Bowl. Because remember, you look at earlier in the season, there was talk of Philadelphia potentially moving on from head coach Nick Sirianni. I thought that was kind of odd. I could understand it maybe a little bit, especially if they take an absolute nosedive. But they did the complete opposite. They came in week 3 into the Caesars Superdome to take on the New Orleans Saints, ended up coming back to beat them, and ever since then they have been on an absolute crazy trajectory, being pretty dominant in the playoffs. And we saw that most recently in the NFC Championship game when they took down their hated rival, Washington Commanders, and ended up beating Rookie of the Year, Jaden Daniels. So I look at them, I look at how much they predicate and making sure that they get the running game going. It's really interesting to see because you also look at Kansas City side, the fact the way they play the run defense and guys like Chris Jones and George Karlaftis and others on that defensive line, they haven't allowed a 100-yard rusher in 18 games. Whereas you look at Saquon, he's been running all over teams. The first carry versus the Commanders was a 60-yard touchdown. He ended with 3 rushing touchdowns on the day and has gone well over 100 in all of the playoff games and has been on an absolute roll as of late. that's a big thing and something to really look out for, because something's got to give. Because it's hard for me to believe, even though Jalen Hurts has looked pretty good against Kansas City over the years, it's hard for me to believe that Jalen Hurts is going to go for 300 plus and multiple touchdowns throughout the game, while Saquon goes for under 100. Like, it's hard for me to see the Eagles end up winning that game and having those two things happen. Saquon having a bad game rushing, not necessarily getting a lot of rushing attempts, while Jalen throws it all over the yard. It just doesn't seem like what would happen compared to what we've seen so far in the 2024 season. While you look at what's going on with Kansas City, I think it's really interesting because, for sure, the fact that you brought in Kareem Hunt after Isaiah Pacheco went down. Now you have two guys in the backfield that you can actually trust to handle the football. Isaiah's been a little bit interesting, though, because as of late, he's not cutting as well. He's starting to fall and not necessarily running as hard or as effective as he used to in years past. So that's something really interesting to think about if you're betting. I would say if you're looking at the leading rusher for Kansas City, I would probably have to go with Kareem Hunt. Now, it is interesting because of how good that defensive line for Philly is. There's definitely opportunities for Patrick Mahomes to get out the pocket and scramble himself for a couple of yards. So if you're looking at props there, I could see Kansas City and Patrick Mahomes probably hitting the over. Depending on the sports book you're looking at, it could vary by a couple of yards, but I think that's something that you could look out for, because one scramble of 15 to 20 yards, all of a sudden you've either passed it at that point or you're right there to hit the over. So I think that's something else to look out for. But the end-all, be-all, and I don't want to necessarily put it all in the quarterbacks, but the fact that Jalen Hurts, to me, is one of the better guys in the game, and he does what he needs to win games, whereas Patrick Mahomes, he basically does the same thing. He still has that gunslinger mentality, and he wants to throw the ball all over the yard, but he also has the mindset of, okay, I know I don't have to do everything because I have guys around me that can make the plays for me. Him and Travis Kelce, of course, have that connection, so that's going to be something to look out for in this matchup. Whereas you also look at the receiver core for the Chiefs. DeAndre Hopkins has been basically a no-show, but from what I've seen on film, he gets a lot of attention, and teams want to make sure that even though D-Hop is 32 years old, they don't want to get beat by him. And by proxy of that, because of so much attention trying to guard Travis Kelce, trying to stop the run game, trying to make sure that Patrick Mahomes doesn't scramble for those big 30-plus yard touchdown runs like we see every once in a while, and making sure that D-Hop doesn't beat him on the outside, that leaves guys like Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy to get open in space in short and intermediate yard situations. So that's something to look out for in this game. I don't necessarily think that Kansas City and D-Hop will get a big game like we've seen so far, but it is something to look out for, because if that continues the trend like we've seen, Worthy, the rookie wide receiver out of Texas, has potential of going for a big game. I think when it's all said and done, for the Eagles to win it, I think Saquon has to rush at least 20 times and make sure that he goes for well over 100 yards, snapping the streak that Kansas City has had, making sure that 100-yard rushers don't happen on their defense. But if I had to make a pick, and we'll end it off with this, I think that the Kansas City Chiefs will end up being Super Bowl 59 champions, going for the three-peat, and end up defeating the Philadelphia Eagles for the second time in 3 years in the big game. I'll say the final score is 30-28. Appreciate you listening in to yet another edition of Cleats and Sneaks. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, ESPN Southwest Louisiana, where we do all the local content. Golf, racing, pro sports, all of our local teams. Saints, LSU, UL, McNeese, the Pelicans. We do it all here at ESPN Southwest Louisiana. So if you're interested in any of that, this is the place for you. Until then, I'm signing off. I'll talk to you next time.